Alright, back with another video. This time what we're going to do is we're going to do the bed. Remember, really the only thing we unwrapped was the posts, the blanket, and the pillow. The nice thing about this one is I'm going to, mostly it's going to be pretty quick because it's going to just be some quick recap of stuff we've done in the previous videos. But I did want to show you guys how bump mapping can be applied, and we'll do some more bump mapping on some of the later projects, also, later models as well. But I also want to show you 2D painting in Mudbox. First and foremost, we'll start with the bed. So I've got that opened up in Maya, and what I can do, of course, is I can take the bedposts, right? Because we're not taking the whole groups over, we want to take kind of one at a time. So I've got the bedposts, and I'm going to go File, Send to Mudbox, Send as New Scene. So I've kind of seen this a couple times, right? It's going to open up Mudbox. Give that a minute. Like I said, sometimes if you see this, just minimize it and then kind of just go back to kind of bring it back up, and usually it's fine. Alright. In this case, I probably want my display to be back on smooth shade because it was off from last time. So remember, display menu, smooth shade, right? That kind of just makes it smooth shaded. Alright. So I'm going to go back to Maya and I'm going to select the blanket, right? And we're going to go File, Send to Mudbox, but this time we're going to add the current scene because we've already kind of started the new scene. We just want to add this blanket to that scene that's already open in Mudbox. So add a current scene. There's our blanket, and then we'll just go back and we'll grab the pillows because remember, that's the only thing we unwrapped. We didn't worry about the mattress. The metal posts here are going to be a shader. In fact, I'm not even going to worry too much about the paint on the knobs because we're actually going to assign a specific preset material to those as well, kind of like our knobs on our end tables. So I'll just send the pillows, File, Send to Mudbox, Add to Current Scene. There we go. And now we've got our pillows. In this case, I'm not really going to get anything else open from Maya today, so I'll just kind of close Maya up. So we're just focusing on Mudbox. If your computer's powerful enough, you can usually multitask between these fairly well. We're not doing any heavy sculpting. But if you're finding some lag, maybe just have Mudbox open instead of both Maya and Mudbox. All right. And so let's, first and foremost, we can always remember hit A because that's kind of like your fit selection. In this case, I don't have anything specifically selected, so it's just kind of selecting all. Of course, Alt and your mouse buttons, left, middle, right, do your navigation just like they do in Maya. And of course, like we've done before, we want to go over to our object list, right? So remember, it's just on the right side here, these 3 tabs. You can do our viewport filters, but object list will make it pretty easy to select your objects. In this case, we can see we can select the bedposts. And I'm going to turn the eyeball off for the other 2, right? Remember, there's that kind of white dot. Technically, you can lock them. It's fine, but I just like not seeing them so they're not in the way when I'm painting. All right, so those eyeballs are off. And the object's still selected, right? So we can still see that the object that's got the eyeball on is selected, and it's yellow. We can go to Layers. And, of course, the Paint button's on instead of Sculpt. And we can go to the white pages, right? 3 white pages, and that allows us to make a new layer. In this case, we'll just do, let's call these bedposts. There we go. Give them a name. Default size of 2048 is fine. TIFF ape, it's fine. And once again, we're not really going to need bump for this one, right? We're just looking at getting kind of like a nice varnished kind of lacquered wood, much like our desk and our end table. So just the diffuse channel is fine. So we'll hit OK. And there we've got our layer. Now the yellow is annoying to paint with, right? So remember that yellow is just indicating that faces are selected. So an easy way to get rid of that is just go to Edit, Deselect All. There is a quick key for that though, you guys see, Control D. And there we go. And now we've got our layer, and we're going to be able to paint on the object we want to. Now just like we did last time, we really don't want any empty pixels in this layer, right? So one of my first steps when it's a brand new layer and it's like the only layer we have, and it's going to be the layer that's on the bottom for any other layers you might use. In this case for the diffuse, which is the color. We just click on Paintbrush. Remember down here in the left corner, Paintbrush. And we just pick a color. In this case, I'm going to use a default color I've been using on the other videos as well. But really any color you want is fine. Remember, just click on that, pick a color. Strength 100 is usually a good idea. And we can scroll down, right? There's this little scroll bar to here. Scroll wheel will do as well. Flood paint layer. Now we've got filled in pixels. Now, in this case, we're going to do what we did last time for kind of the legs for other stuff. So it's great little further practice at that. I'm going to turn on projection brush, right? Because when we're using stencils, projection brush is good to use over paintbrush, so we click on projection brush. Once again, if you need to, there is this stencil menu here with some of the stencils that come with Mudbox. The white kind of dot with the bracket, if you click on that, you can add a stencil through there. I, however, of course, have been using Image Browser. Up here in the top left corner, right, we have 3D View, UV View, Image Browser. And you see Image Browser set up from last time, but remember, and you can always go back and watch those videos, but remember, the little folder, the white folder here, looks like it's opening. You can click on that, and you can go find wherever your texture folder's at, right? If you've already at this point started to build up a decent texture library, you just go find that folder, select it, select folder, and then all your folders with any textures you have in there is available. I'm going to scroll down to the wood one, double click on that, and I'm just going to use kind of, I think I'm going to use that blue we did last time, a little more interesting color than that wood there. So we can click on that one, and then of course white S for stencil. Now if I go back to 3D View, you see sometimes it doesn't show up the first time, so go back to Image Browser and just click on that white S for stencil again, and usually the second time you'll see it. Of course, remember when you set the stencil, you'll see that your properties are now set to the stencil options here instead of projection brush. So in this case, I can click on projection brush again, and if we want, we could tint that color, right? If I don't want it to be exactly that blue, or maybe I want it to be a little bit more of a dark blue, I can always darken my color, maybe give it a bit of a blue tint a little bit, right? So I can tint that a little bit. Of course, we can zoom in our camera. Remember, Alt-right mouse button. I want to make sure my brush size is smaller. Remember, hold down B and left mouse drag can make your brush smaller. Of course, the brackets can do that, and of course you have a size controller right here. Remember, anytime you click on one of your brushes over in the paint tools area down here in the bottom left corner, those properties are going to be here. And you see how that kind of tints as like a darker blue? So remember, you can totally control much better the way you want to actually paint this stuff, right? So you don't have to use exactly the color it's giving you. You can pretty effectively go in and just kind of tint it, right? So in this case, I just kind of tinted it a little bit. I'm painting here. Remember, we're not going to worry too much about making the tops painted because normally I would do some painting on it, show you how to do spec maps, but I don't want to texture quite as many things as we did. I want to kind of scale this back just a little bit, like about 15% of what I normally do, just to make it a little easier for you guys because of the weird circumstances this semester. So we're just going to use material presets for those tops there. All right. So I'm just kind of rotating around, painting. And remember, I'm trying to make sure to paint just on the area that I want the paint to go in and look at it largely from there because the projection painting is projecting from the camera, right? You're basically 2D painting, but since you can move your model around, it does make it quite easy to just kind of paint it exactly where you want it to go on the model and have it go on there pretty nicely. There we go. So we're just kind of moving around here. Remember, S left can rotate, S middle mouse button, right, can move, and S right mouse button can scale. So if you want to make adjustments to your stencil, you can do that, of course. So like I said, don't worry too much about getting a nice paint job on the actual knobs on the top there. Like I said, we're going to apply a material preset to that when we get back into Maya later on. In fact, you notice we haven't really taken any of the textures out of Mudbox yet. We're not going to worry about that yet. We're going to come back and do that in a later video. I'm going to show you guys how to export stuff out of Mudbox, and then of course eventually import them into Maya. For right now, we're really just getting ourselves into Mudbox and painting textures, right? Because these are their own Mudbox scenes, right? With their own textures. So pretty easy for us to just kind of focus on getting the painting we want done, and then we can come back and, of course, export this stuff out to eventually get it into Maya. That'll be the subject of later videos, though. So in this case, it's kind of getting some good practice, just understanding how to use projection painting and stencils. I'm actually going to show you, like I said, some 2D painting a little bit later today, and also how to make bump maps. That'll kind of be neat as well. Those will be the new things, because right now you can kind of see I'm really just repeating myself. But that's the thing about Mudbox is in 3D projection painting tools, they're not honestly as complicated or as hard to learn as, say, Maya is. It's a little more straightforward, if you will. In this case, I'm going to hit off for stencil. Remember, down in the bottom right corners, these little menus here, there's a stencil menu. We have that. Hit off, and it just turns the stencil off, right? It's a great way to kind of just turn that off. All right. In this case, I haven't saved a scene yet, so I'm going to go File, Save Scene As. So it's a good place to start off with the first one. And of course, I still want it to have most of the same naming convention we've had before, but I can change this to bed. And then .mud. Now, you might not always find that it prompts you to do the .mud, and you should be fine if you don't have to, but I've been finding it does prompt me on this computer, so it never hurts to add that extension, even though it should be doing it here. So let's save. There we go. And we've got that painted. Like I said, we're not going to worry about painting these. We're going to put a material preset on those later on, so if you leave those a little bit kind of unfinished, the little knobs on top, that's okay. All right. And if you go to UV view, right, you can see there's all the texture in your painting, right? And it goes right over those seams. That's what's so cool about it is since you're projecting from the view itself, it basically ignores the seams and just paints exactly what you have. Like I said, the only thing you have to worry about is the polygons that face away from the camera, the texture will kind of like have this like smeared effect because you're just not projecting from a very good view, right? The polygons, they're normal directions, the polygons are facing away from the camera. All right, so we got that saved. Now what we can do, of course, is go back to object list, right? Remember, layers is kind of where we are painting, but object list is really how we select and control the visibility for objects. Object list in Mudbox is pretty much just like Maya's outliner, which we've definitely had some practice with our cleaning up our history and outliners for our previous projects. So in this case, I'm going to turn the eyeball on for the blanket. And you can turn both of them on, right, just to kind of see. And I'll turn the eyeballs off the other ones, and I'll select the blanket, right, so that the blanket is selected. All right, so now I'm going to go back to layers, so that I just turn the eyeballs off of the other two, right, just those little white dots. Make sure to select just the blanket, so it's yellow. Go to layers, and there's no layer there, right? That's why we sent these over independently, right? We'd send as new scene, and then we went to add to current scene, then we went to add to current scene, so that way Mudbox has a much easier job of recognizing them as separate objects to have separate layers on them. So in the layers menu, we just click on the one with the 3 white pages. There we go. Call this blanket. And remember, the nice thing is just the defaults for this stuff is usually going to be fine, diffuse, TIFF 8-bit, 2048. I don't want to complicate it any more than we have to. But remember, you can change formats, at least within the presets. Mudbox gives you higher bit depths. You can go higher resolutions, and you can paint different material channels. But for right now, those defaults are fine. Just give it a name. Blanket. There we go. Of course, we don't like the yellow, so we go to Edit, deselect all. Control D is the quick key for it, though. And what we want to do now, and we're going to do the same thing on our pillows. Now, we've been doing 3D projection painting, where we're projecting right from the camera on the model. And that is awesome. You're going to do the bulk of your texture painting that way. It goes over seams like there's not an issue. As long as you're changing around your views, there's usually a bit of natural fall off at the edge of the brushes, so they blend fairly well. And we'll kind of talk about that stuff a little bit more, particularly when we get to our chair too. But here we have a pattern that we're going to want to be highly specific, a highly geometric, repetitive pattern, right? So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure to go to Paintbrush. So we have this flood layer, right? And then I've got the default colors fine, strength 100. I'm going to scroll down, flood paint layer, and I'm going to go to Project Brush. And we're going to want to project a specific kind of texture on here. So I got Projection Brush on. I'm going to go to Image Browser, and I'm going to kind of go up one, because remember, I've kind of already set up that folder and all that stuff. So I'll just, the folder next to it, the one with the blue arrow, right? So there's this folder, and then there's this one other white folder with the blue arrow. We click on that, and that takes us to here. Now there's a lot of different textures in here that I could be using. I've got like a fabric one here. Let's see if there's any cool fabrics that work well for here. So let's go to Fabrics. And you can see I've actually got, that wood library is one of my smaller ones. I've got a lot of other patterns here. Now, in this case, I really want to try to use a highly geometric pattern. So I'm going to try to find a cool geometric pattern like, say, this zigzag stripes, right? This will work pretty well for us. So I click on it, and you'll see that it's a highly repetitive, highly geometric pattern, right? This actually is not going to paint as well on a blanket, or if you even wanted to have a texture like this, like say on a lamp, right? We're not doing our lamp for this project, but if you wanted some kind of zigzag pattern like this, these are the times when 2D painting is actually a better option. So in this case, I've selected this. I'm going to hit the white S for stencil. we'll go to 3D view, and there it is. Now in this case, I'm going to kind of get my view here, and then we'll kind of hit S, right mouse button to scale it down a little bit. I'll make my brush size a bit bigger, right? B for brush, and hold down B and left mouse button, you can make the brush size bigger. Remember, you can always click on paint projection brush again itself, and you can see there's actually a bit of color tint here. I don't want that. I want to paint exactly this. So remember, click on that color. We can set it back to white. All right, and now I want to paint. And so far it's coming out great, right? We're getting this exact kind of nice zigzag pattern for our blanket. That's going to be great here. And I'm just really making sure to kind of paint right over to the edges as well. But now you see when I rotate, it didn't paint that properly. And in fact, you see how I kind of smeared that? So how do I paint the side here? Well, I can hit S left mouse button to rotate my zigzag. I can hit S right mouse button to kind of scale it up, right? And S middle mouse button to kind of zoom it. But that's really going to kind of be hard to match it, isn't it? Right? So you can see in this case, when I want this exact pattern to go perfectly over the whole entire blanket, when we get to the side, it's not really working that well, right? Usually this is not an issue. You saw with all of our wood painting earlier, it was fine. We could paint over it. 3D projection painting is what you're going to use the bulk of the time for texturing. But there are times when 2D painting comes in really handy. And this is one of them. We can see right now that this just is not going to be easy to paint. So how do we do 2D painting in Mudbox? I'm going to hit S middle mouse button, just kind of move the stencil over for a minute. There is a feature in Mudbox. It's in the UVs and Maps menu, right? So we see there's a UVs and Maps menu right here. And you'll see that 3 down is one called Flatten to UV Space. Flatten to UV Space. So I'm going to click on that, UVs and Maps, Flatten to UV Space. And you'll notice what it does is it takes your actual geometry, and you might be behind it, so just kind of rotate your camera around a little bit, zoom out or in. Maybe hit A to fit all, right? Remember, or frame selection, sorry, A is frame selection. But you might be kind of on the other side and it's kind of set to only show one side, right? Although in the display menu, you can tell it to show both sides. So you can always do that, right? Display menu has show both sides. But you'll notice that it took the geometry and unwrapped it to be identical to your UVs. So that's what's really cool about the UVs and Maps flattened UV space. It's flattening your model to the UV space, right? To the UV shape. And what's great about that is now if I get my blanket pattern right over that and I paint, you'll see how it's going to go on pretty easily, right? Make it a little smaller. And you see how we can paint that on there perfectly, right? It's going to go in there exactly the way we want to, all over the place, right? And we can just hit F or off for stencil, right? And we can go back to UVs and Maps and we can unflatten from UV space, right? So this flatten kind of does it to make it two-dimensional. Unflatten takes it back to being your three-dimensional model. Now you might notice it's a little grayer. That's okay. If you turn your layer off and on, or actually I think even object list, sometimes you just turn the visibility off and on for that, you'll see it kind of resets it. It's just one of those weird things where it kind of has it grayed out a little bit. So, you know, just maybe going back and turning the visibility off and then back on for your object will have it match better. But you notice how that went on perfectly, right? Because we were painting two-dimensionally. So we're painting based on the nice kind of relatively straightened UVs, right? There's actually a straighten feature in Maya that allows you to straighten those up even more perfect. But for us, it wasn't really going to have any huge impact on our blanket and how the texturing works. So let's go back to 3D view. But you can see the benefit of 2D painting in this case, right? Because we were actually able to paint, and that's one of the reasons why we had our UVs fully unwrapped as one giant piece, right? No seams. If there had been seams there when we go to paint, you'd have issues, right? So to have this work really well, you have to have as few seams as possible and have it fairly straight like this. Like I said, you could straighten it even more. There are straighten commands inside of Maya that are fairly easy to use. You know, we're just not trying to go over everything about UV unwrapping. It's not exactly a texturing class. But you see the advantage of 2D painting is it gets you to see just the UVs as one set, and you can paint them based on the two-dimensional shape. So 2D painting in this case you saw was actually superior, And that's one of those great options there for that. So our blanket's almost done. There's something else I want to introduce you guys today before we do the pillows. And I'm just going to repeat the same thing I was on the pillows. So an object list, we'll go back to layers, and there's our blanket layer. Now, you could paint a bump map independently, right? You can make a whole new layer and paint your bump map to not match this. In this case, though, and often, far from always, but often, you're going to want your color map and your bump map to actually match. So one of the things you can do inside of my Mudbox is if you right-click on the layer itself, so I'm going to the blanket layer, right-click on it, all right? When I right-click on it, there's all those options that we saw kind of in this little kind of dot up here. New layer, you can delete a layer, you can import layers from outside or export them. That's how we're actually going to get this stuff out. So if you want to start experimenting, you can just select a layer, export it. And if you have multiple layers, particularly if they're like, say, in the same grouping, you can merge visible. It's kind of like flatten in Photoshop. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to copy this layer, right? Because I want the color layer, but then I also want it to be a bump layer as well. So we duplicate it, and now you'll see there's two layers, copies of each other. Now I'm going to right-click on that copy, although it could be the original, it doesn't really matter. But I can right-click on that layer, and one of the other options in here, so let's just right-click on the layer again. Instead of duplicate selected, there's an option right below it called move selected to. And you see you can move this diffuse layer, which is your color, to specular or gloss, and these control different aspects of shininess. You can move it to incandescence, which is glow. We're going to do a little bit of that on the clock radio. Bump maps is what we wanted, though. So I'm going to click on bump map, and now what you're going to notice is there's actually bumpiness on this model. Now if I turn my color layer off, you'll see you can actually see that it looks like there's surface detail there now. And you see how the kind of highlights and the shadows change on it? But you'll notice if we zoom in really, really close, it is fully flat. So this isn't actually changing the geometry, but the light interacts with the pixels to create highlights or shadows that make it look like it's got actual texture, right? Bumpiness, right? Roughness, fabric patterns, even more than just the color map does. And the way it does that is the lighter pixels, right, will be highlighted, right, by the actual, particularly depending on the angle of the light and the angle of the view. But the lighter pixels, right, anything that's closer to white will look raised. Kind of a middle gray is kind of, if you will, like your zero, right? So that's off, right? It'll be neutral, none. The further you go from, like, say, a middle gray to black, what it will do is it's going from 0 to kind of negative 100. White, you can think of white as 100, kind of middle gray is 0, and black is negative 100. And so when your pictures go from middle gray to black or dark gray, what's going to happen is they're going to be lit to look like they're pushed in, like they're depressed. And it's this contrast between kind of raised and pushed in or depressed that makes it look like it has bumpy detail on the surface. And that's really cool. So you can see how it's kind of a fake way to give you bumpiness. Any of you guys have ever played a video game and you go up against a brick wall, often in video games, you'll see that it looks great and lights interacting with it and shadows are moving on it from different angles and it really looks like it's brick. But then you get to that angle where you put your head up with your character right up against it at that right angle and you see it's flat. So you can see here that this is actually flat. If you will, it's basically kind of an optical illusion, basically. That's how you can add a bump map. Isn't that cool? And they match, right? So in this case, if we wanted to, we could always adjust the strength of the bump layer to make it a little less intense, right? That's kind of neat. And you see it's in its own group now, right? So there's now a bump map group with bump map layers. So I can make more layers that are different for the color and independent layers that are for the bump, right? These are now their own independent textures. I can modify these if I wanted to. In fact, on our later videos, we're going to do that. I'm going to save that again really quick. And let's do our pillows really quick, just to kind of explore that same kind of basic idea and concept. So I'm going to go back to Object List. And I'm going to turn the pillows on and turn the blanket off. We can just select the pillows, right? Because we always like to make sure to select the objects so we see the yellow. We can go to layers, and you see there's no layers there. So we'll do kind of those 3 white kind of layer pages. Call this pillows. And you'll see that we can use the defaults. Although if you wanted to start a bump map from scratch, right, you can go to the channel down here. Instead of using diffuse, you can use bump map. So you could start your own map from these different channels instead of always from color. In this case, we want them to fairly match, and it's great practice at duplicating and seeing that we can have our color map be turned into a bump map later on. So let's say OK for diffuse. And of course, Control D is the quick key for deselecting those polygons. Although remember, that is in the Edit menu. Deselect all. And in this case, 3D projection painting wouldn't work too poorly for these. But let's just do a little more 2D painting so we have some practice with it, right? So remember, we can go to UV's Maps menu right here. flattenUVspace. You might have to go look for them. I usually hit A to fit all and then kind of rotate around until I see them, right? Then we can zoom in a bit here. There we go. And in this case, of course, we want to use our projection brush. I'm going to go back to Image Browser, and I'm going to find something that I think would be a reasonably cool, pillow kind of fabric. Kind of feel like that first one I had will probably work well enough, but as you guys go along, you find out which fabric you like best for whatever you want to do. So I think that will work fairly well for us. I'll hit Stencil, right? Remember that white S is your stencil. And then we can zoom out. And we can easily just kind of projection paint these on. In this case, I'm just going to go B for brush and left mouse drag to make the brush size smaller. And I can quickly just kind of paint that on there. And of course, we can hit S, middle mouse button, to move the stencil down here. Now keep in mind that this won't necessarily match up at the borders anymore, but since we put those seams on our UVs, kind of where they naturally would be on a pillow anyways, that probably won't matter that much, right? Because usually your fabric won't match identically where there's a seam anyways. But like I said, really, we could have done this 3D projection painting, it wouldn't have been too bad. The blanket's kind of a little more of a pronounced issue for it. But it's a great way to get you guys practicing the fact that you could do 2D painting with this. And you notice your stencil works here as well, right? So your projection brush and stencil work with these, which is really, really cool. And you notice I was able to paint just what I wanted from the stencil, which is great. So let's hit off. So because I don't need my stencil anymore. I'm going to go to UV's Maps. And remember, flatten's how we get it to this state, but then we unflatten from UVspace. So it's in that same section. Let's hit A for kind of a frame all or frame selection. And there's our pillows. And you notice they're a little dark, a little gray right now. So like I said, usually just kind of turn the eyeball off and then back on. You see how kind of it wakes up Mudbox. I feel like it kind of doesn't lock, but it kind of locks them until you've done that. There's your pillows. You notice how the seams aren't matching up, right? That's the drawback to 2D painting, right? Is that you can't paint over the seams because you're not projecting from the camera, right? You're painting it two-dimensionally. So two-dimensional painting has that benefit of highly geometric repetitive patterns can go on pretty nicely, but you have to deal with the seam issue. And that's something you generally don't have to deal with when you do 3D projection painting. So they definitely have their own strengths and weaknesses. In this case, because pillows kind of naturally have a seam and the fabric would be different, somewhat different on each side, this should be fine for us. And of course, if we want to, we can copy this layer to be a bump layer. Probably not terribly bumpy. It is a pillow. We want it to be fairly smooth. But I just want to get you guys some practice with copying bump maps. So remember, you can go to your diffuse pillows layer, right-click on it, duplicate it, so there's now 2 of them. Right-click on one of those, move selected to bump map, and there's our bump map. Now remember, your layers actually have their own lock and their own eyeballs, right? So you can actually turn the visibility off and on for your layers also, or even the whole group, right? So remember, you have eyeball and lock here, which do the same thing they do in object list. Now, that's a bit bumpy for a pillow. In fact, your blanket and your pillows aren't going to be terribly bumpy. But they're probably going to have a little bit of graininess to the fabric. So, the bump map, remember how we have strength? For most layers, that's going to be kind of like opacity, particularly for color layers. It's going to basically be the transparency of the layer. But for the bump map, it's going to work more as intensity. So if I click on the strength area here, the little slider, and I pull it down, you see we can make that bump map very, very subtle. So it's there and it's adding a little bit, right? You can kind of see it does add a little bit to it. We don't have to add a lot, right? So we just want to add a little bit of subtle bubbliness to it. Now, that's not going to translate exactly to Maya, but Maya has its own control for this that will allow us to get this eventually. But, you know, when we're doing it in Mudbox, it gives us a good idea of what we're looking for. So now we can put bump maps on stuff. We can go back to Object List, and we can turn the eyeballs on for everything else. But now we know how to copy layers and move them to different channels like bump layers. And we can even flatten to UVspace and unflatten to do 2D painting when we need to, right? So we can actually see, let's have a couple of cool new features here. And we're going to keep, that'll probably be it for 2D painting for the rest of the term, but we're definitely going to use some more bump maps and even paint some of our own independent bump maps later on. So we'll definitely be spending some more time with bump maps. I just figured this would be a great way to get you guys introduced to bump maps there. All right.